symposium. We have been treated to several wonderful presentations today about plurinationalism, about the struggle for equality and justice in Ecuador and the United States, and for all the people and non-human natures in both nations and beyond. And we've also been presented with many challenges. How, for example, to think and to act outside or beyond the market and perhaps the state. How to build solidarity economies without replicating some of the worst problems that we are trying to oppose. And how to build real participatory democracy. A colleague of mine, Angana Chatterjee, often reminds me that sustainable knowledge is one of the most important foundations of sustainable communities. And so in my view, Sumak Kawsay is also largely a project focused on defending and preserving and building sustainable knowledge, as much as it might be focused on sustaining our ecological and social support systems. And El Secretario said as much, said it very well earlier. Now, I don't think I've heard anyone speak very directly today about the Yasuni ITT project. And so I want to take a minute or so to offer a thought on that. I think this was, and hopefully will continue to be an ambitious and important project. And I know many people, including Presidente Correa himself, were deeply disappointed in the response of the world community. But with respect to that, I think that the plan to stop or to not begin oil drilling in exchange for funds from wealthy countries makes sense in terms of having the wealthiest countries pay to prevent future climate change. We can say it in many different ways, but I think of it as the principle of proportionate and differentiated responsibilities, and we see this in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and we see it in much of the discussion about environmental justice globally, as well as in the United States. However, if I may be so bold, that same plan always runs the risk of reinforcing inequality between the various nations, perhaps underscoring the idea that Ecuador and other Global South communities require assistance from what we call Annex 1, or wealthy nations. So to achieve sustainability when wealthy nations have done little to advance that goal is troubling. So the contradiction seems to be inescapable for Yasuni, and that is that the funding from wealthy nations is necessarily rooted in capitalist and therefore anti-ecological and anti-social practices. So while there is a real appeal and an element of justice and reparations in these nations funding this project, it also reveals how difficult it is to achieve sustainability. So the so-called failure of the Yasuni ITT project, in my view, was not that we were unable to see the money being raised for this project, or this is at least one way to think of it, but rather the very design of the project in the first place seems to replicate global hierarchies so that Global South is reliant on the North, and capitalism, in a very real sense, is called upon to save socialism. And in a conversation I had earlier with Hazel Carby about another project, in some ways, by structuring a conservation plan around global fundraising, one runs the risk of implicitly monetizing nature. And so I offer that comment maybe not so much as a critique, but as a realization, a reminder of how difficult it is what we are trying to do here, and a reminder that the nation of Ecuador, in my view, stands alone for taking these bold, ambitious, and difficult steps to even name this problem, when governments like my own would never dream of it. El Secretario Ramirez and the ambassador, their perspective on the good living, I believe, is eloquent, generative, and productive, particularly with respect to the problem that they point to as being not so much about the prevalence of poverty, which, by the way, Ecuador has done incredible work at reducing the level of poverty in their nation, but it is the problem of the violence of excessive wealth. Particularly, El Secretario put this so eloquently in, I believe it was the New Left Review article. My colleague Lisa Park and I build on this idea in some of our own work in the book The Slums of Aspen, where we did field work in Aspen, Colorado, which, as many of us know, is a playground for the wealthy, the rich, the elite, who have the audacity to claim that that city, that space is an exemplar of ecological sustainability. And in 1999, they codified this principle in a resolution that had two parts. The first part reiterated that Aspen, Colorado would be a sustainable, green, ecologically resilient community. And the second part of this resolution was that the way that the city of Aspen was going to maintain that status was by keeping out Latinos, inmigrantes, brown people, all of the others from this community, to literally exclude them. And so we did a project that tried to excavate the historical process by which an environmentalist could also be a nativist, that is, someone who believes strongly in building up borders and excluding people. And we found, perhaps not to our surprise, but we were quite disgusted to find that Aspen is not alone. And this is, again, part of this broader problem that El Secretario and the ambassador have pointed out, the violence of excessive wealth. And in this project, Lisa Park and I term this the problem of environmental privilege. And so we looked at so many of the studies, the research on environmental racism globally and in this hemisphere, and so much of that research focuses on this problem of disadvantage, of environmental harm that is experienced by indigenous peoples, working class peoples, immigrants, people of color, women, and so forth. And we said, absolutely, this indeed is a problem, but if we're going to understand the problem of environmental injustice and environmental racism more particularly, we need to also examine the flip side of that. And this brought us to this question of environmental privilege. Environmental privilege results from the exercise of cultural, economic, political, and other forms of power that some groups, usually a small group of people, enjoy, that grants them or enables them exclusive or near exclusive access to coveted environmental amenities. Forests, parks, mountains, rivers, coastal properties, elite neighborhoods, open lands, etc. At least that's how it works here in the United States. But if we look around us, we find environmental privilege in so many other parts of the world, while Aspen is, of course, an outstanding and instructive case study. And so for us, the case of Aspen illustrates the importance of understanding poverty, of understanding environmental inequality, by getting out of the ghetto, by getting out of El Barrio, by getting off of the reservation, and getting into places where racial, economic, gender, and cultural privilege are the order of the day. The fact that all of these communities, communities of color, indigenous communities, working class communities of any race, face greater environmental harm is indeed a social problem, but we must also, in our view, frame the existence of environmental privilege as a social problem and indeed the source of environmental injustice. So I thank Secretario Ramirez for raising this critical point, and to underscore, for me, thinking about ecosystems, that this point about environmental privilege makes me realize that, of course, a safe and nurturing and healthy environment should never be thought of as a privilege, right? This is what we've been talking about today. This is something that everyone should have a right to enjoy. And so this brings me, as an ecologist, as a Buddhist, to this question of our connections. Professor Camacho stated it well when she said, we are a part of Ecuador, and Ecuador is a part of us. We are a community of linked fates. And I don't think this is just a powerful cultural framework. Again, as I said, it is an ecological fact. The ambassador said this morning that we cannot separate ourselves from nature. And connecting her comment to Professor Camacho's comment, I would say then we also cannot and must not separate ourselves from each other. A theme that was also widely spoken to today was the importance of social movements and politics for social change. This was something we heard time and again. And I'm reminded of something else, actually, Professor Camacho said briefly, which was the importance of listening. And I think I will end with this. I remember hearing an interview with community activist Angela Blackwell Glover, I think is her name. And she was asked, what do you think is the single most important skill of a community organizer? And I was driving in Washington, D.C., listening to this alternative radio station when she was being interviewed. And I had to pull over to listen to this interview because it was so profound. But she said exactly what Professor Camacho said. She said, in my view, the single most important skill for an activist, for somebody trying to foment social change, is the ability and the commitment to listen, And that was one December afternoon when I heard that. And 2 weeks later, on the 1st of January, or maybe the 31st of December, that was my New Year's resolution, to just do a better job of listening. So, and I'm still working on it. So I urge all of us, each and every one of us here today, and everyone we are connected to do that on a daily basis, to listen to yourself and listen to each other, and also listen to those whom we typically think of as not having voices, the non-human natures that we rely on and that we are a part of and that we exist because of and interact with every day. So I will end there. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.